Mm-hmm. Bunch of dickheads in that book, but not nuts.
All righty, we're live stream now. Okay, this and that. Welcome. This and that for the 2nd of January. We'll talk a little bit today to as a change of pace. Also, because I have to figure out how to give people access to the audio book of Marx Capital Volume 1, which I've recorded the first three of 30 hours of the book, just for people's amusement. But I said it as, whatever. Anyway, you could say that what's going on in the current moment is a crisis, and it's the symptom of several things: a quest for high income, financialization, globalization, and at the same time, slow accumulation, trade deficit, and indebtedness. So all of those things are going on. There are symptoms of neoliberalism and US hegemony, and kind of the crisis feeds back into itself. And for those who need the capsule definition of neoliberalism, several writers have criticized neoliberalism as an insult or slur used by leftists against liberals with varieties of liberalism that leftists disagree with. More than once have I been scorned on coasts because I was using the term to attack, or some people thought I was attacking liberals. It's taking it personally, that's all. British journalist Will Hutton called neoliberal an unthinking leftist insult that stifles debate. On the other hand, many scholars believe that it retains a meaningful definition. Writing in The Guardian, Stephen Metcalf posits that the publication of the 2016 IMF paper, Neoliberalism Oversold, helps put to rest the idea that the word is nothing more than a political slur, a term without any analytical power. Gary Gersel argues that neoliberalism is a legitimate term and describes it as a creed that calls explicitly for unleashing capitalism's power. He distinguishes neoliberalism from traditional conservatism as the latter values respect for traditions and bolstering the institutions which reinforce them, whereas the former seeks to disrupt and overcome any institutions which stand in the way. And we've seen Radhika Desai before, director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, argues that global capitalism reached its peak in 1914, just prior to the two great wars, anti-capitalist revolutions, and Keynesian reforms. And the purpose of neoliberalism was to restore capitalism to the preeminence it once enjoyed, which is kind of what's going on now, the kind of Gilded Age references and that sort of stuff. She argues that this process has failed as the contemporary neoliberal capitalism has fostered a slowly unfolding economic disaster and bequeathed to the world increased inequalities, societal divisions, economic misery, and a lack of meaningful politics. So that's kind of the one version of the technical thing. I include the, because it has to have a handbook, there is a handbook of neoliberalism. And of course, Rutledge would publish it. Dumanil Levy, the couple, write on the crisis of neoliberalism in the handbook of neoliberalism. This is the preliminary version online. The crisis of neoliberalism. The implementation of neoliberalism in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a rather painful process with the multiplication of crises around the world, as in the United States during the 1980s, Japan in 1990, Mexico in 1990, Korea and the other countries of East Asia in 1997, and Latin America, notably Argentina in 2001. The expression crisis of neoliberalism is, however, used to designate the major crisis that hit the United States, Europe, and indirectly many other countries in the so-called financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession of 2009, thanks to the dramatic policies conducted in support of financial institutions and the stimulation of the economies by huge deficits of government expenses. The repetition of a scenario similar to the Great was avoided. A structural crisis. As of the 2010s, the world is no longer in crisis. But the US and even more Europe are not out of crisis with low growth rates, what is now denoted as stagnation and skyrocketing government debts. So it's exactly where we are at the current moment as we approach a new presidential regime. The establishment of neoliberal capitalism cannot be understood as a merely economic phenomenon, a change in policies and institutions. The crisis of neoliberalism is the expression of the inner contradiction of a political strategy supported by basic national and international economic transformations, whose main objectives are the restoration and increase of the power, income, and wealth of upper classes. But the international domination of the US worldwide is considerably weakened during the most recent decades and profoundly affected by the crisis itself as other countries were forging ahead. The new policies now undertaken in the US testify to a strong determination on the part of the government and the Federal Reserve to revert this declining trend. If these strategies were successful, US neoliberalism would be retrospectively understood as a stepwise process, with a first episode whose major stake was the restoration of the hegemony of upper classes, and a second now targeted to the restoration of US international hegemony. Much remains, however, the final outcome is far from obvious. Panama Canal, Greenland, etc. The analysis is conducted in 5 sections. First, we examine the historical background in terms of relations of production, classes, and class struggle. Second, we attend to the success, according to its own criteria, of the new social order and its at least provisional failure in the crisis of 2008, marking the end of a first episode in the neoliberal endeavor. The third section is devoted to the resurgence of traditional Keynesian and Marxian interpretations among leftist academics, which may shed some light on the complex course of events, but in our opinion fails to address the specific class and imperial features of the chain of events that led us to the crisis. Fourth, we address the significance and prospects of the new policies in the US that aim to restore the country's economic hegemony. The second episode that remains to be written. A final section is devoted to broader historical prospects. So, number 1 of Demenul and Lévy's work on the neoliberalism and crisis. Neoliberalism as a successful strategy of class reconquest in the overall dynamics of managerial capitalism. Relations of production are in constant evolution, even within each of the successive modes of production. In this respect, the history of the US since the independence of the country is quite specific, as from the origin, capitalist relations of production developed on the new continent at a distance from the remnants of feudalism or the transition of the Ancien regime. But reaching the end of the century, the emergence of new managerial features signaled a basic transformation in relations of production, with the 3 revolutions at the turn of the century, namely the corporate, the financial, and the managerial revolutions. The US capitalism of the early 20th century was already a hybrid society, a managerial capitalism. A straightforward quantitative expression of this secular tendency is the invasion of the upper segments of the income pyramid by wages compared to capital income, rents, dividends, and interest. Considering the top 1%, that is the fractal 99 to 100, of households in the income pyramid prior to the Great Depression in the US, capital income still amounted to 1.5 more than wages, emphasizing the capitalist nature of the fractile. In 2012, the ratio had been inverted as wages were 4 times larger than capital income. Nowadays, even within the top 1,000th of the income pyramid, wages are twice that of capital income. The progress of managerial relations of production cannot be separated from the transformation of class patterns. For the traditional bipolar scheme, that is, capitalist proletarian classes, one must substitute the threefold pattern: capitalist, managerial, popular classes. The position of managerial classes was originally that of a new intermediate class, but these classes generally gradually moved to the top at the conquest of the status of a new upper class besides capitalists. Within both classes, capitalists and managers, a huge or large spectrum of positions, obviously. For example, the professional managerial class. Our interpretation is that a transition is presently underway towards a new, which managerial classes would be the new upper classes. The hybrid features of managerial capitalism are the expression of this transition. Now, concerning the politics of the transition, the pattern of domination and alliances between the three classes are of crucial import. Since the early 20th century, we distinguish between three. Number one, the first financial hegemony. From the beginning of the century to the Great Depression, capitalist classes unquestionably dominated social relations in alliance with the emerging class of managers, an alliance to the right. Number two, the post-war compromise. From the New Deal to the 1970s, a new social order was set up. This order was the outcome of the Depression itself, in the context of the rise worldwide and under the threat of self-proclaimed socialist countries for capitalist classes. The new social order was the expression of the alliance between popular classes and managers, an alliance to the left within social democratic of Keynesian societies. The main social forces in these movements were popular classes, but managerial classes assumed the leadership in the new management of corporations and the definition of new policies. Number three, the second financial hegemony in neoliberalism. In the context created by the crisis of the 1970s, the continuing struggle on the part of upper classes, and the weaknesses of the post-war compromise, the alliance swung to the right between capitalist and managerial classes. The new trends were already manifest during the 1970s and early 1980s, with the dramatic restoration of the income and wealth of upper classes still on the rise after 2000. The management of corporations was radically transformed to the benefit of shareholders. New policies were defined. Free trade and the free movements of capital worldwide placed the workers of all countries in a situation of competition, not losing their chains. In the US, the progress of the purchasing power of the bulk of wage earners was blocked, and the old controls that the New Deal had placed on financial institutions were lifted. Note that neoliberalism is a phase of managerial capitalism, not an ideology, although there is obviously a neoliberal ideology, that of free market economics, that is limited government intervention, as in classical liberalism. One must, however, keep in mind that neoliberal governments remained strong and played a crucial role in the launching and perpetuation of the new social order. So figure one shows the average yearly income and constant purchasing power per household in each fractile of the income pyramid since World War I in the United States. The fractals are listed under the figure. The logarithmic scale provides a clearer view of growth rates. The variables have been rescaled to 100 for the average of the period 1960 to 1973, when the growth rates of purchasing powers were almost the same for the various fractals. The vertical continuous lines in 1933 and 1974 delineate the three social orders above. The dotted lines in 1960 and 2000 separate two sub-periods within the second and third period. So that's kind of what this looks like, sort of. You can see that weird convergence there, right, between 1960 and 1980-ish, which is interesting. I mean, it is sort of the range of the end of the Cold War and the beginning, or not the end of the Cold War necessarily, but a clear moment in the Cold War as and the rise of Reaganism. The section of the three social orders above is clearly apparent in the trends of purchasing powers and income inequality, beginning with the comparatively high levels of inequality prior to the New Deal. A dramatic reduction occurred during the first few decades, up to about 1960, of the new compromise to the left. Then all purchasing power grew at similar rates. From about 1974 onward, a new spectacular diverging pattern is apparent, with skyrocketing high income and the income of the 0 to 90 stagnating, even being reduced. Both the historical profiles in wages and capital income are involved in these profiles. The following are noteworthy. First, due to their comparative and rising importance, wages are a crucial component of the distinct trends in each period. Second, the income of the top income fractals was dramatically reduced during the intermediate period, sometimes described as a financial repression. In neoliberalism, upper classes were able to increase both upper wages and capital income. The return of capital income seems to contradict its secular comparative decline, but despite its spectacular amplitude, this movement remained inferior to the rise of wages and confined within very small income brackets at the top. Number two, the structural crisis of the early 21st century as class and national specific. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx compared capitalist classes to apprentice sorcerers, to the aim of increasing their powers and income and pushed forward by the dynamics of accumulation and competition. These classes boldly innovate and remove all impediments to their action, as in deregulation. They periodically lose control of their magic. Marx described this inclination as a general feature of capitalism, and there is no doubt that credit and more generally financial mechanisms are pushed to and finally beyond the limits during the recurrent phases of expansion. The crisis of neoliberalism is not any of the standard exercises in witchcraft, however, as during the phases of recurrent overheating and recession. Truly specific of the social order is the amplitude taken by these developments over various decades and across countries, as well as their sophisticated interrelations that conferred to the crisis in structural character. The crisis is the crisis of neoliberal capitalism, not any form of capitalism, and even more specifically, the crisis of neoliberalism under US hegemony, as suggested in the left part of the diagram. In the phrase, neoliberalism accounts for the specific class character of the crisis. The words US hegemony account for the particular US aspects of the process. This hegemony, in which the towering positions of US financial institutions and of the dollar, note as reserve currency, are key elements allowed for the continuation of the growing disequilibria of the US macroeconomic trajectory to the unsustainable levels of imbalance finally reached after 2000. No other country would have performed anything similar. Now, of course, it was helped on by the fall of the Soviet Union, etc. Returning to the chain of events, two basic categories of factors were involved. The upper part of the diagram in figure 2, following arrow A, points to the quest for high income, meaning the eagerness of upper classes to restore and increase their income and wealth after decades of comparative setback. In a broad context of deregulation, the 1980s were a period of unchecked progress of financialization and globalization, in particular financial globalization. A lot has been written concerning financial instability inherent in the advance of financial mechanisms, like Michael Hudson. Market mechanisms, the stock market, derivative markets, etc., are center stage, but also the mechanisms supporting loans, such as securitization or credit default swaps. Important risks were also involved in the process of globalization, in particular, the potential imbalance of foreign trade, the flows of short-term capital across the world, and the lost control of credit mechanisms and financial markets. The lower block of factors, that is arrow B, is more specifically typical of the US economy. Number one, with the new methods of management and the rising flows of direct investment towards the rest of the world, the rate of capital accumulation dramatically diminished. The variable in figure 3 is the shape of GDP and of non-residential investment of the US private economy. After 1980, a dramatic downward trend was substituted for the earlier rising trend. Number two, a crucial determinant of the crisis was the deficit of foreign trade reaching about 5% of GDP prior to the crisis. The excess of imports over exports results in a deficit of demand towards the enterprises located on national territory. These enterprises are at the origin of the flows of income resulting from production under the form of wages and capital income. This income should return to these enterprises when the purchasing power is used to buy goods and services. When, as a result of the deficit of foreign trade, a fraction does not go back to domestic enterprises, a deflationary chain of events is initiated. This is what happened prior to the crisis. Stimulation was required under the form of a flow of new loans correcting for this deficient demand levels. The new borrowings could come from enterprises, the government, or households. In the US in those years, enterprises did not borrow to the aim of investment, another component of demand, only in support of financial activity. An even larger reliance on government's deficit was not in line with neoliberal policy options. The new borrowings came from households financed by mortgage loans. Number three, a direct consequence of the growing deficit of the US foreign trade was the rise of debts. The debt of the country towards the rest of the world increased mechanically with the deficit. The flows of financing from the rest of the world can also take the form of the purchase of stock shares, but new loans were the main channel. The second debt was the rising debt of households, up to the unsustainable levels reached prior to the crisis. You can see this there. The relationship between the two categories of determinants, arrow E, is more important. That is, between the two sectors. For example, financial deregulation and the rise of financial institutions allowed for the upward trend of the debt of household and new bold forms of refinancing by private label issuers, besides securitization by government-sponsored enterprises. The Federal Reserve met with growing difficulties in controlling interest rates as financial globalization allowed U.S. institutions to borrow from foreign, notably Japanese, banks. The two sets of factors converged, arrows B and D, during the second half of the 2000s, causing the crisis in the U.S. economy. The crisis was rapidly exported to the rest of the world. First, many countries were themselves engaged to various extents in similar unsustainable practices. Second, a significant fraction of U.S. bad securities had been sold to these countries. The crisis unfolded as a stepwise process. A first phase can be dated to January 2006 to July 2007, with the fall of building permits, home sales, home prices, and the beginning of defaults. The devaluation of the riskiest segments of mortgage-backed securities began, MBSs. Between August 2007 and September 2008, the situation of U.S. financial institutions deteriorated, with liquidity and losses, but the crisis was still a U.S. phenomenon. The most dramatic phase was September 2008, February 2009, with the multiplication of failures. The contagion to the rest of the globe and the contraction of output. The trough of the recession was reached by mid-2009 in the United States, while the default on household debt reached unprecedented levels. Stock market indices plunged. The reaction of central authorities was rapid and strong. Number one, the Federal Reserve engaged massively into the purchase of agency MBSs, mortgage-backed securities, and supported the financial sector, loans, and direct holdings, while federal funds rates had declined to levels close to zero. And number two, government deficits exploded, as they will soon. Since 2010, a rather steady growth rates, about 2%, then prevailed in the United States, supported by the continuing strong involvement of the government and the Federal Reserve, while the economy of the European Union went on stagnating, paralyzed by the attempt to correct government deficits in the absence of more profound transformations. Other countries in the rest of the world, like China, were hit by the recession in the old centers and then recovered. Number three, big number three, the comeback of traditional Keynesian Marxian interpretations. The violence of neoliberal capitalism had already been a source of revival of the most critical analyses of capitalism, see in this volume. The occurrence of the crisis in 2007 to 8 prolonged these early assessments. The crisis is explained by basic tendencies inherent in capitalism, like, number one, financial instability, 2 and 3, a mismatch between aggregate supply and demand levels due to either, number two, a deficient demand levels caused by a bias in income distribution, or number three, excess supply on the part of enterprises, number four, declining profit rates, and number five, the historical recurrence of long waves. We've talked about that before, Kondratiev waves. The return to the traditional analyses of crises in capitalism is sometimes asserted vigorously as a refutation of approaches describing the crisis as the crisis of neoliberalism rather than capitalism itself. In our opinion, the crisis must be understood in reference to neoliberal managerial capitalism, and abstraction should not be made of the specific features of this form of capitalism. The boundaries are not easy to draw between various trains of thought, as, for example, the reference to Keynesian financial instability is directly evocative of Marx's analysis of fictitious capital. Similar views concerning deficient demand levels are typical of the two trains of thought, though the particular mechanisms may be distinct. Number one, financial instability. There's no surprise in the resurgence to the fore of financial instability as a crucial determinant of crises, a factor whose relevance is unquestionable. Within the Keynesian train of thought, references often made to Minsky's, of Alan Minsky et al., analysis of the pattern of cumulative rise, sudden reversal, the Minsky point, and collapse typical of financial markets. Examples are Paul Krugman, 2008, and Paul Davidson of 2009, pointing to the rise of financial mechanisms and deregulation. The analysis of Joseph Stiglitz, 2010, emphasizes the mistaken macro policy undertaken in response to the 2001 recession and in the wake of the collapse of the stock market. The Federal Reserve drastically diminished the interest rate and thus fed the housing bubble that the greed of financial institutions contributed to inflate, resorting to highly risky procedures. Among Marxist economists, even if the terminology is distinct, the core analysis hinging around the risks inherent in the accumulation of fictitious capital, that is, financial assets, is in line with the above. At a general level of analysis, we have no disagreement with the emphasis on financial mechanisms, deregulation, and mistaken macro policies. They were all part of the 2008 crisis. But the class determinants, that is, accounting for the prevalence of these stubborn trends during more than 3 decades of neoliberalism, should not be overlooked. Number two, deficient demand as accounting for low levels of utilization of productive capacities. Typical of the Keynesian train of thought, but also Marxist perspectives, is the reference to deficient demand levels. The origin of the mismatch between supply and demand is located on the demand side as an effect of the low share of wages or its declining trend, as Sheikh and Valley have pointed out. The argument rests on the notion that wage earners spend a larger share of their income than capitalists. Two difficulties are involved. In the United States, the share of wages did not decline prior to the crisis, and as already stated in Section 2, a basic feature of the period preceding the crisis was the excess demand as manifest in the excess of imports over exports, not deficient demand. More sophisticated interpretations are therefore required. It's not all Walmart's fault. A substitute for the first objection above could be the consideration of upper income, that is, profits and wages, fractals, instead of profits alone. Empirical data shows, however, that the recipients of the upper incomes diminished even more than their savings prior to the crisis than the lower strata. As a reply to the second objection, it is typically answered that the problem was not the lack of actual demand, but the lack of demand financed out of income, a deficiency that caused the borrowing spree, compensating for the deficient purchasing power of households. In other words, consumption and investment were high, but their financing was perilous. A first counter-argument is that in the history of capitalism, the needs of the poor segments of the population never pushed banks to lend without sufficient guarantees. Moreover, these interpretations forget that the control of volumes of borrowing is a basic function of monetary policy. Up to the very last moments, the upward trends of household borrowing were deliberate policy on the part of the Federal Reserve, intending to counteract the effect of the deficit of foreign trade, given the refusal to allow the deficit of the government to perform the tasks. The key role played by the deficit of foreign trade is precisely what is overlooked in these analyses. Number three, overaccumulation. Symmetrical, or used in combination with the above, another reading of the crisis points to an autonomous tendency towards overaccumulation or oversupply, a traditional Marxian contention. U.S. enterprises allegedly went on increasing their productive capacities independently of the actual levels of demand, possibly as a consequence of competition or rapid technical change. It is, however, difficult to imagine why U.S. enterprises maintained this puzzling behavior during several decades without adjustment. The downward trend of the capacity utilization rate in manufacturing industry would support this interpretation. We have serious doubts concerning the relevance of this empirical foundation, as taken at face value, the low levels of capacity utilization rate during the 1990s would imply that overaccumulation was already a feature of the period when the U.S. economy was growing at rates of about 4% during the boom of new technologies. Finally, the analysis of delinquencies on loans clearly demonstrates the quite unusual pattern observed prior to the 2008-2009 recession, as opposed to the 2000-2001 recession, as the delinquencies on industrial loans did not increase before the recession, as in usual cycles, while the delinquencies on mortgage loans exploded. Number 4, declining profit rates. As the crisis of the 1970s had been a profitability crisis, numerous Marxist economists prolonged this analysis to the new crisis. A crucial issue is therefore the calculation of profit rates, with the usual problems met in the definition of profits and capital. There's actually a huge gap between, number 1, profit rates measured using a very broad definition of profits, that is, total income minus total labor compensations, divided by the stock of fixed capital at replacement cost, and number 2, the rate of retained profits, that is, profits after laying out taxes, interest, and dividends, divided by enterprises' own funds. The profit rate in the first broad measure partially recovered after the decline that caused the crisis of the 1970s. Subtracting all taxes, the profit rate recovered its levels of the 1960s as profit taxes were diminished. It is actually the increased flow of dividends in neoliberalism that caused the decline of the retained profit rate. That is a tendency inherent in neoliberal management procedures, reward the stockholders. This decline was a crucial factor in the downward trend of investment in Figure 3, but did not cause the crisis. The housing crisis began in 2006 because of lags and was later transformed into a recession, which is what the current one will. In a profitability crisis, like during the 1970s, capitalism sinks because profits are the oxygen of capitalist corporations, and there's no significant financial component. In a crisis like the 2008 crisis, capitalism explodes as financial mechanisms play an important role. A symmetrical line of argument is sometimes put forward by Marxist economists, pointing to a restoration of the profit rate prior to the crisis, pinned on a decline of the share of wages, Mosley, Sheikh, and Hussein. And that is kind of the dominant analysis. Number 5, long waves. Special emphasis must be put on interpretations hinging around the theory of long waves or Kondratiev cycles, often with a clear reference to the historical framework developed by Ferdinand Braudel and the Annales School. Capitalism goes through long phases of expansion that culminate in episodes of financialization as a manifestation of the depletion of profitable opportunities in the non-financial sector. Then a long phase of decline occurs. The causes of the depletion of non-financial investment opportunities is pinned on various mechanisms evocative of overaccumulation, but not with precise contents. In the case of Emanuel Wallerstein, the crucial factor is the rise of costs, energy costs, labor costs, and the like, whose final outcome will be the extinction of capitalism. Oh, Wallerstein, such hope. Number 4, big section number 4, a broad agenda, exiting the current crisis, avoiding a new crisis, remedying the current stagnating growth, and restoring the U.S. international hegemony. From the viewpoint of its class objectives, namely the restoration of the power and wealth of upper classes, neoliberalism was amazingly successful. Concerning the U.S. economy, the consequences were, however, devastating, as in Section 2. A major crisis occurred, threatening the continuation of the entire endeavor neoliberal trends were at the origin of more than a 3-decade-long decline of investment rates on U.S. national territory when other countries were forging ahead. The already weakened U.S. international hegemony is at risk. Thus, the program for the coming decades is clearly set out. You can see how tariff policies are not going to help that. Macro policies are central, but one cannot remedy a structural crisis only by the Keynesian stimulation of demand. Can't buy our way out of this with gold sneakers. Stabilizing the economy, consolidating the aggregate economy, still supported by government deficits, that is, really going out of the current structural crisis and avoiding the repetition of major crises in the future, number one. Number two, stimulating investment and growth, what implies forms of re-territorialization of industrial production, notably within key industries. Number three, restoring the U.S. international hegemony conditioned by the two previous requirements, notably perpetuating the domination of the U.S. network of financial institutions worldwide in the structure of Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism. This is where the relationship between the class and international components is the closest. That is, it's a reciprocal relationship. Obviously, the role of the dollar is crucial. A first issue is the political motivation. A sharp difference between the US and Europe is that within the EU or the Eurozone, there is no national feeling since there is no European nation. The project of continental integration was the product of the consciousness after the devastation wars of a common cultural heritage and solidarity, but the differences between countries, like language, remain of considerable import as evident in the treatment or absence of treatment of the crisis. Policies in Europe are clearly in line with basic orthodox tenets like the downward pressure on labor costs and the eagerness to tranquilize the banks holding government securities by cutting government deficits. See austerity. Nothing that would allow Europe to move forward. Conversely, in the US, the national factor plays a central role. See Trump. And the consciousness of the necessity of safeguarding the international hegemony of the country may provide sufficient grounds for the establishment of a new course. Actually, the process is already underway. A second issue is the social political nature of the endeavor, knowing that what we referred here to ongoing trends from the viewpoint of upper classes and not to what should, in our opinion, preferably be undertaken. A strong involvement of central authorities, notably the government and the Federal Reserve, is required. No private institution, no market can perform the task. See cryptocurrency. And the conduct of such policies implies a significant break from neoliberal ideology and practices. The new course of events is typical of what can be called administered neoliberalism, at odds with the classical liberalism of free markets. Principles and methods are, however, much less important than the class foundations and objectives of the social order, in particular when the international domination of the country is involved. There's clearly a class component in the definition of these new directions, as government officials, a segment of managerial classes, and a component in the alliance at the top play a central role, a New Deal politically oriented to the right. The action of high officials within central institutions was and is still central in the treatment of this crisis. They should play a prominent role during the coming decades. If they don't, the objectives will not be reached. A third issue is the contents. Regulating financial mechanisms. A law, the Dodd-Frank Act, was voted in the wake of the crisis to place limits on the action of financial institutions. Its implementation was to a large extent blocked by the Republicans. One thing is clear, the volume of transactions on derivative markets did not diminish with the crisis, and the threat of a new financial crisis is still there. Indeed, it is. The competitiveness of the U.S. economy. The target here is the re-territorialization of industry with notably the objective of remedying the deficit of foreign trade. In the lower segments of employment, workers are available to work at a very low cost and deprived of basic social protection. Active policy stimulated shale gas as a source of energy with dramatic effects on the cost of energy. Given the differences in productivity worldwide, and including the cost of transportation, the costs of one unit of production in manufacturing industries in the United States and China have now converged. These new achievements are of utmost importance since most of foreign trade is a trade of manufactured goods, despite the increase of U.S. exports of services. To these, one must add the new forms of hidden protectionism, notably by the definition of technical norms to which imports are subjected, and industrial policies in favor of specific industries in new technologies, electric cars. As of 2014, an examination of the latest data shows that the deficit of foreign trade still amounts to 3% of GDP compared to the 5% observed prior to the crisis. Macro policies. Since the 2009 recession, a growth rate of about 2% has been maintained, but the deficit of the government still amounts to 6% and rising of GDP. That is, levels that are typical of the trough of recessions. The Federal Reserve is fully committed to the restoration of the economy, holding a huge stock of treasury from its sponsored enterprise securities, long-term interest rates, some held by China. Nonetheless, the private sector is still paying back its debt instead of borrowing, and the downward trend of investment has not been inverted. To date, no autonomous, unsupported restoration of the aggregate economy has been achieved. Well, it sort of moved in that direction during the Biden administration. These policies guarantee the U.S. economy a form of reprieve. The key issue will be the continuing involvement of central authorities in the future and the resistances concerning corporate governance, foreign investments abroad, lavish flows of dividends, extravagant compensations at the top, and the like. Number 4, taxation. The Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the FATCA, constrains U.S. citizens, even living outside the country, to report their accounts in the rest of the world, and foreign financial institutions to inform the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, of the existence of those assets. To what degree the device will be extended to the world and prove efficient remains to be determined. Major countries have signed agreements with the U.S., though neither Russia nor China, but the number of tax havens in the list is impressive. Contrary to the measures above, the new controls could be detrimental to rich individuals forced to pay taxes, but remedies must be found to the deficit of the government. In the abstract, the potential inherent in the new policy seems unquestionable. Other countries are, however, also active and may improve their own competitiveness as fast as the U.S. economy, or even faster, notably with respect to patents and the price of energy. See Saudi Arabia. The class interests inherent in neoliberalism place major limits on policies in most, if not all, of the above respects, and the contradiction between class and territorial objective is acute, as clearly demonstrated during the first neoliberal episode prior to the crisis. Strengthening the situation is really a historical prospects. Returning to the general framework of Section 1, that is, relations of production and class struggle, the political implications of the above are obvious and of historical import. At the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. assumed a clear leadership in the transition from the traditional capitalism of the 19th century to managerial capitalism in the corporate, managerial, and financial revolutions. The capability of the United States to lead the path in the establishment of the new institutions of managerial capitalism was the main determinant of the international hegemony of the country during the 20th century under the new forms of Wilsonian informal imperialism as opposed to traditional colonial empires. At stake in the early 21st century are the political options governing the trajectory toward most advanced forms of managerial capitalism. Two options are open. Number 1 is a course evocative of the post-depression path to the left that commanded the reduction of inequality, that is, the opposite of the rise at the top. And number 2, a movement along the right branch of the bifurcation, as in neoliberalism. The first option failed during the 1970s. The crisis of neoliberalism was hastily interpreted by analysts in the left as the failure of the second track. Can the conduct of the second post-crisis episode turn this failure into success, thus demonstrating the compatibility of class and territorial hegemonies? One can have serious doubts, given the amplitude of the task to be accomplished and the obvious resistances to the required adjustments that can be expected on the part of the upper classes, like paying more taxes. These are the domestic contradictions, but the external contradictions are also acute. Will Europe remain staggering at the crossroad with the consolidation of conservative policies, or is there a chance for a left turn on the old continent? And what of China, the other champion of the national factor in the country, the tightest alliance merger between capitalists and government officials, an obvious candidate for a new global hegemony, which is what we always talk about. So, anyway, those who come in late, this is a article by Demenil and Levy on the crisis of neoliberalism, and it is worth reading just because it encapsulates pretty much the whole critique that we were looking at in Hudson and a bunch of other things. It's all there. I mean, this is a pretty accurate description. It, you can see where all the movements are, where the trend lines go, and yes, no one talks about this on the uh, media business channels, but if you had one or two people just doing a history of it in this way, it would change people's minds politically, certainly, rather than trying to constantly sell you more stocks and whatever securities, et cetera, and propping up a lot of other stuff. So I'm at the end of my usual rope, and let me see if there are questions or comments or interventions or brickbats. Yes, first rule of Neoliberal Club is neoliberals don't talk about neoliberalism. Oh, maybe don't say that on the stream. Indeed. I, I shouldn't have said that. That other thing. Yeah, we will talk about that further. Not that we have a huge audience or anything, but maybe we will at some moment. Anyway, uh, hearing no interventions, brickbats, denunciations, or interventions, I will stop the share, return, leave the live stream, and then we can start swearing at each other.